The call came in just before dawn. The voice on the other end was hurried and filled with concern. A local hiker had stumbled upon a bear deep in the forest, lying motionless near a dried-up stream. The animal was barely breathing, its once powerful frame reduced to a frail shadow of what it had once been. The caller was unsure if the bear was even alive. Its eyes were open but distant, its ribs visible through patches of unkempt fur. Flies hovered around it, a grim sign that nature had already begun to claim what it believed was lost. The rescue team, accustomed to handling wildlife emergencies, wasted no time. They had encountered old and injured animals before, but something about this case felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the way the bear lay, as if it had accepted its fate long ago. Armed with tranquilizers, medical supplies, and a reinforced transport cage, they set out toward the reported location, their vehicle bouncing along the uneven dirt trails leading into the wilderness. When they arrived, the scene was heartbreaking. The bear did not move. It didn't even flinch as they approached. Its fur was clumped with dirt, patches missing where deep scars ran across its body. Claw marks and bite wounds told a story of past battles, fights for dominance, or perhaps desperate struggles for survival. Its paws were cracked, likely from long journeys in search of food. The once majestic creature had been reduced to a mere shadow of itself, a breathing remnant of a past filled with struggle. One of the rescuers, a man who had worked with wildlife for over 2 decades, crouched near the bear, studying its condition. He ran a gentle hand along its side, feeling the jagged bones beneath its thick coat. The bear's breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. "This one is at the end of the road," another rescuer muttered, shaking his head. The words hung in the air, heavy with sorrow. The decision was made quickly. The team could not leave the bear there to suffer, whether its condition was caused by old age, starvation, or injuries from past fights. There was no dignity in letting it fade away in pain. They had seen cases like this before. When an animal reached a point where survival was no longer possible, the humane choice was to grant it a peaceful end. The sedation was administered, ensuring the bear felt no stress as they carefully lifted it onto the stretcher. The process took time, as they didn't want to cause further harm. Even in its weakened state, the bear was massive, its weight a reminder of the power it had once held. As they secured the straps, one of the younger rescuers hesitated, staring at the bear's face. "Are we sure?" she whispered. "What if—" The lead rescuer sighed. They had seen hesitation before, especially from those new to the work. "It's the right thing to do," he reassured her. "We don't let them suffer." The transport vehicle rumbled as they loaded the stretcher inside. The drive to the wildlife vet clinic was long and silent. The only sounds were the occasional shifts of the bear's breathing, a faint rise and fall that seemed to grow weaker with every passing mile. The team, despite their years of experience, could not shake the weight of what they were about to do. When they finally arrived at the clinic, the staff was already waiting. The facility specialized in treating injured wildlife, but everyone knew that not all cases ended in recovery. Some animals were too far gone, and in such instances, euthanasia was the only option to ensure they did not endure unnecessary suffering. As the doors opened, the air grew heavier. The bear was carefully moved inside, placed on a thickly padded examination table. The room was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over the exhausted animal. The vet, a man with years of experience, approached with a clipboard, glancing at the bear before looking at the team. "Old age?" he asked, scanning for signs of visible injuries. The lead rescuer nodded. "More than that, starvation. Possible past wounds. We found it barely breathing near a dried-up stream. No sign of food in the area. We think it just couldn't make it anymore." The vet exhaled, his expression unreadable as he leaned closer to inspect the animal. He ran his hands gently over the bear's fur, pausing at certain spots as if searching for something. The team stood in silence, waiting for the final confirmation, the official decision that would mark the end of this creature's journey. A quiet, somber acceptance filled the room. They had all prepared for this moment. The paperwork was ready, the procedure standard. Soon the bear would no longer feel pain. But as the vet continued his examination, his brows furrowed. He pressed a hand against the bear's abdomen, feeling something just beneath the surface. His fingers traced along its spine, then toward its limbs. His expression changed. slight at first, then growing more intense. Something was not right. The rescuers, who had been bracing themselves for a routine conclusion, exchanged glances. A creeping sense of uncertainty filled the room. The vet straightened, his eyes fixed on the bear, then turned toward the team. "This might not be what we thought." The words sent a ripple of confusion through the group. What had he found? Had they been wrong all along? The air in the room shifted, no longer filled with sorrow, but something else entirely: suspense. The room remained silent as the vet continued his examination. His hands moved carefully over the bear's body, pressing against different areas, feeling for any abnormalities. The rescuers, who had already accepted the bear's fate, exchanged puzzled glances. Something was clearly not adding up. The vet's initial expression of routine detachment had shifted into something far more focused, as if he were piecing together a puzzle that no one else could see. One of the rescuers finally spoke, her voice uncertain. "What do you mean? We found it barely moving. It looks like it hasn't eaten in weeks." The vet didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the bear's front leg gently and studied the way its muscles reacted. There was weakness, but there was also tension. Malnourishment alone did not explain it. His fingers ran along the animal's joints, searching for stiffness or signs of degenerative disease. What he found instead was something unexpected: heat, swelling, inflammation. "This isn't just old age," the vet murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has been suffering, yes, but not in the way we assumed." He moved to the bear's neck and ran his fingers along its spine. A small gasp escaped his lips as his fingers stopped at a point near the shoulder blades. A lump. It wasn't large, but it was firm and unnatural. The rescuers leaned in slightly, waiting for an explanation. The bear remained still, its breathing slow but steady, unaware of the uncertainty surrounding its fate. The vet turned toward the team, his face serious. "There's something here. It could be an abscess, an infection, or even an old wound that never properly healed. It's hard to say just yet, but one thing is clear: this bear isn't dying of age alone." A ripple of confusion passed through the rescuers. They had seen animals reach the end of their lifespan, their bodies slowly giving out. They had seen the hollowed faces of starving creatures that had spent their final days searching for food that never came. But this bear might have been suffering from something completely different. One of the rescuers spoke up, hesitant. "But we found it collapsed. It was barely breathing. If it's not dying, then why does it look like it has given up?" The vet nodded. "Because whatever it's been fighting, it has been fighting alone for a long time. It has reached the point where its body cannot push any further. But that doesn't mean it is beyond saving." The weight of those words sank into the room. Beyond saving. That was what they had all believed when they first saw the bear. They had convinced themselves that it was an act of mercy to put it down, to let it rest. But what if they had been wrong? The vet turned to an assistant. "I want blood work done immediately. Check for infection, organ failure, anything that could explain this level of deterioration." His voice was sharp, urgent, a stark contrast to the quiet resignation that had filled the clinic only moments before. The rescuers, still processing this revelation, watched as the staff moved swiftly. Syringes were prepared, fluids were brought in, and tests were arranged. The bear, still unmoving, barely reacted to any of it. As the minutes passed, the lead rescuer, the one who had initially insisted that euthanasia was the right call, rubbed his temples. He had been in this field for decades. He had learned to recognize when an animal was beyond saving. But now doubt gnawed at him. "What if it's too late?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. "What if we're giving it hope when there's none left?" The vet didn't answer immediately. He continued his work, checking the bear's breathing, monitoring its response. Finally, he looked up. "Hope," he said quietly, "is sometimes all they need." The rescuers fell silent. The bear had survived in the wild for this long. It had endured starvation, battles, infections. It had dragged itself through whatever pain it was feeling, refusing to let go until its body could no longer bear the weight of survival. Perhaps it had been waiting for a sign, waiting for someone to see what it had been unable to communicate. The test results would take time, But in that moment, everything had changed. The bear had arrived to be put down. It had been carried into the clinic under the assumption that its story was already over. But now, with this new discovery, its story was still being written. No one in the room knew how it would end. But for the first time since they had found the bear, the possibility of a different ending existed. Hours passed in tense silence as the vet and his team worked tirelessly. The bear remained motionless on the examination table, its body too weak to resist, yet its heart still beating, refusing to surrender. The test results trickled in one by one, each revealing a new piece of the puzzle. What they found was astonishing. The bear's body showed clear signs of extreme malnutrition, but starvation alone was not the cause of its decline. A severe bacterial infection had been festering inside, spreading through its system, slowly draining its strength. Deep within its thick fur, hidden beneath the layers of scars and matted dirt, was an old wound, one that had never properly healed. The realization sent a chill through the room. This bear had not been dying from age. It had been fighting a silent battle against an untreated injury that had grown worse over time. Infection had set in, poisoning its body, weakening it day by day. The only reason it had collapsed in the wild was because it had finally reached the breaking point. The vet clenched his jaw, his mind racing. If the rescuers had not found this bear, if they had gone through with euthanasia without checking further, they would have assumed it had simply succumbed to the harshness of nature. No one would have known the truth. One of the rescuers, the same young woman who had hesitated earlier, took a deep breath. So, if it's an infection, does that mean we can treat it? The vet nodded slowly. Yes. With the right antibiotics, proper wound care, and nutrition, there's a real chance. A murmur ran through the room. The possibility of saving the bear had not been part of their plan. They had mentally prepared for an ending, not a beginning. But now the decision was no longer about mercy. It was about hope. The lead rescuer, who had been in this line of work the longest, sighed and ran a hand over his face. "We brought it here to put it down," he muttered. "Now you're telling me it might survive?" The vet met his gaze firmly. "I'm telling you it was never meant to die today." The words landed with quiet impact. No one spoke for a long moment. The weight of what could have happened, what almost happened, pressed heavily on them all. Finally, the vet straightened. "We need to act fast. The infection is severe, but not beyond treatment. If we wait too long, its body might not be strong enough to fight back." Without hesitation, he began issuing orders. The bear was carefully moved into a larger treatment area. Intravenous fluids were set up, pumping much-needed hydration and nutrients into its system. A carefully measured dose of antibiotics was administered, targeting the infection that had brought the animal to the brink of death. The deep wound, hidden beneath tangled fur and layers of neglect, was cleaned for the first time in what must have been months. The bear did not move. Its body remained still, but its breathing was steady. That, the vet told himself, was a good sign. The rescuers watched as the clinic staff worked, their minds struggling to process what had just unfolded. They had come here expecting to say goodbye to a life that had already ended in spirit. Instead, they found themselves at the beginning of an uphill battle, one that would demand time, patience, and a belief in the impossible. One of them whispered, almost in awe, "We almost made the biggest mistake of our lives." No one disagreed. The night stretched on, and the clinic remained awake. The bear, whose fate had seemed sealed just hours ago, was now under the care of those who refused to give up. Its body was still weak, its future uncertain. But one thing was clear. This was not the end. Not yet. The first night was the hardest. The bear remained unresponsive, its body too weak to react to the treatment it was receiving. The vet and his team stayed by its side, monitoring its vitals, checking its breathing, and adjusting the fluid levels to ensure it was getting the nourishment it needed. Every now and then, a flicker of movement in its paws or a twitch of its ears gave them hope, but for the most part, it remained still. The rescuers lingered longer than they had planned, watching through the observation window. None of them had expected to be here, seeing the same bear they had assumed was beyond saving, now lying in a quiet battle between life and death. They exchanged quiet words, their voices filled with uncertainty. Was it too late? Had they intervened just in time, or had they only prolonged the inevitable? Morning arrived, and with it, the first sign of progress. The bear stirred. It was not much, just a slow shift of its massive body, but it was enough to make the vet's heart skip a beat. He moved closer, carefully checking its reflexes. Its breathing was stronger than the night before, and though it was still too weak to open its eyes fully, there was an undeniable difference. The antibiotics were working, the fluids were helping, the bear was responding. The team wasted no time. They worked in shifts, ensuring that the bear was never left unattended. The wound was cleaned again, the infection slowly being brought under control. Small amounts of liquid food were introduced into its system, giving its body the strength it needed to begin the long journey toward recovery. Days passed, and the changes, though gradual, were unmistakable. The bear, once a lifeless figure on the examination table, began to move more frequently. Its paws twitched, its breathing grew steadier, and on the fourth day, it lifted its head for the first time. The sight stunned everyone. The vet had been preparing medication when he noticed the shift. The bear's head, though still heavy with exhaustion, was raised slightly, its eyes barely open but alert. For the first time, it was aware of its surroundings. A deep silence fell over the clinic. The lead rescuer, who had been the most skeptical, exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know how," he muttered, "but this bear is still fighting." The vet allowed himself a small smile. He had hoped for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt unreal. The next week was critical. The bear's appetite slowly returned, and though it could not yet stand on its own, it responded to touch, shifting slightly whenever the vet checked its wounds. Each small victory added to the growing belief that this animal, against all odds, might have a future after all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light through the clinic windows, the young rescuer, who had first questioned their decision, approached the bear's enclosure. She crouched beside the thick glass, watching as its chest rose and fell. With steady breaths, she whispered, "We almost lost you." The bear, eyes half closed, did not move, but for the first time, there was something different in its presence. It no longer felt like a creature waiting to die. It felt like one learning, slowly but surely, how to live again. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the bear showed signs of strength returning to its body. It no longer lay motionless for hours on end. Instead, it moved, small, deliberate shifts at first, followed by more coordinated attempts to stretch its limbs. The staff watched in quiet amazement as the same creature they had once assumed was beyond saving began fighting its way back to life. The first true breakthrough came on a quiet morning. The clinic was calm, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of equipment and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The vet had just finished his routine check when, without warning, the bear did something none of them had expected. It tried to stand. The movement was shaky, its massive paws pressed against the floor, trembling under the weight of its still weakened body. Its muscles, long unused, struggled to hold firm. For a moment, it seemed as though it would collapse again. The staff stood frozen, their breaths caught in their throats. Then slowly, with what could only be described as sheer determination, the bear rose onto its feet. It was not a graceful movement. Its legs wobbled, its posture uneven, but it was standing. For the first time since it had been found near death in the wild, it had lifted itself up, refusing to remain helpless any longer. A stunned silence filled the room before someone let out a breathless whisper. "It's standing." The vet watched with quiet satisfaction. He had known this bear had a fight left in it, but seeing it now, seeing it refuse to stay down, was nothing short of extraordinary. Over the next few days, the progress continued. The bear, still weak, took its first unsteady steps. They were slow and deliberate, each movement filled with effort, but it was progress nonetheless. The infection that had nearly claimed its life was now under control, its wounds healing better than anyone had hoped. Its appetite grew stronger, and soon the small portions of liquid food were replaced with solid meals. The rescuers, who had once believed this animal was beyond hope, now watched in awe as it devoured its meals with an urgency that spoke of survival. It was as if its body had remembered what it meant to be strong, what it meant to live. But what stood out the most was the change in its eyes. When it had first arrived, its gaze had been dull, lifeless, as though it had already given up. Now there was something different, a flicker of awareness, of curiosity. It no longer looked like an animal waiting for the end. It looked like one who had chosen to fight. The young rescuer, who had questioned their decision that first day, stood by the enclosure, watching in quiet wonder. "I can't believe we almost lost it," she murmured. The lead rescuer, the one who had been the most doubtful of the vet's choice, crossed his arms and let out a slow breath. "Neither can I." By the third week, the transformation was undeniable. The bear moved with more ease, its posture straighter, its steps surer. The once starving creature that had been carried into the clinic, barely breathing, now walked with newfound strength. The vet stood beside the team, arms crossed, watching as the bear took another few steps across the enclosure. "If we had given up that first day," he said, his voice thoughtful, "we would have never known what it was capable of." No one needed to respond. They all knew the truth. This bear had not only survived, it had defied every expectation placed upon it. By the time a full month had passed, the bear was unrecognizable from the frail creature that had been carried into the clinic. Its once matted fur had regained a healthy sheen, its muscles had strengthened, and the hollow emptiness in its eyes had been replaced with something undeniable: life. The infection had fully cleared, and though the scars of its past remained etched into its body, they were no longer symbols of suffering. They were proof of survival. The team gathered around as the vet prepared for one final evaluation. He moved carefully, observing every detail, measuring the bear's weight, tracking its movement. It was strong now, stronger than any of them had dared to hope. The rescuers watched in silence. They had all been changed by this experience. Each of them had walked into this clinic believing they were doing the right thing, that this bear had reached the end of its road. They had been prepared to offer it mercy, to relieve it of its suffering. But instead, the bear had taught them something profound. It had not needed an end. It had needed a chance. The vet finally turned to face them, his expression calm but filled with something deeper. Satisfaction, perhaps, or the quiet understanding that they had all learned a lesson that would stay with them forever. "This bear was never meant to die that day," he said simply. The words settled over them like a wave, each syllable sinking into their thoughts. They had been moments away from making a decision they could never take back. They had nearly assumed there was no hope when, in reality, there had always been a chance. The young rescuer, the one who had questioned everything from the beginning, swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" she asked. The vet looked at the bear, watching as it moved freely around the enclosure. "It's ready," he said. "Not for the wild, not yet. But it deserves a future, a real one." Arrangements were made for the bear to be transferred to a wildlife sanctuary. There it would have space to roam, to rebuild its instincts, to reclaim the life it had almost lost. It would never have to struggle for food again. It would never have to suffer alone. The day of the transfer arrived, and the team stood together, watching as the bear was carefully guided into the transport unit. It did not resist. It did not fear them. It seemed to understand that this moment was different. As the doors shut, securing the bear inside, the lead rescuer let out a long breath. He turned to the vet, shaking his head with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You were right," he admitted. "We almost made the worst mistake of our lives." The vet gave a small smile. "Sometimes survival isn't just about the body," he said. "It's about the will to keep going. All it needed was someone to believe in it." The transport vehicle rumbled to life, pulling out of the clinic and onto the open road. The bear was heading toward its second chance, and as the team stood there watching it leave, they knew they would never forget what it had taught them. Because in the end, it wasn't just a bear that had been saved that day. It was their understanding of hope itself,